Well, hey friends, welcome to week 3. Ignore that. It's week 3 of Hebrews class. And today we're going to be looking at chapters 5 through 7 and how Christ is greater than the priests of old. And so, so it was a deep dive into some heavy nerdy stuff on Tuesday. And so I'm going to still provide that heavy nerdy stuff. So it's just a fair warning. Like this is going to be one of the more intellectually grueling, it's not grueling, but it was an odd class, I would imagine the participants would say. But anyways, goal of all Christian instruction is of course worship. And so if you heard my sermon from this last week, this is an idea I've been thinking about of we're headed for the new heavens and the new earth. We're headed for a better day. I call it the end game. What are you most looking forward to in that? You know, evil will be gone. Celebrations will be there. What are you looking forward to? And how does knowing that that's where you're headed grow your affections for the Lord? So hit pause, take a moment, think about it, talk it over with someone, and then jump back in. Okay, like I said, we're going to be talking about priests and Melchizedek today. And then if you're listening to this next week, so the 10th through the 15th, I'm out of town. So we will not have class then. We'll just pick it back up the following week, the week of the 17th through whatever. And so, so we're going to talk about priests and Melchizedek today. So the whole point of Hebrews 5 through 7, and honestly 8 through 10 is actually going to pick up a little bit of this too, because it's going to talk about sacrifice, and Jesus is both, well, I won't get too far ahead, but anyways, the idea of these chapters is just how great Jesus is as a high priest. Okay, so that's like the main idea, that Jesus is the priest par excellence. Like he is the priest to end all priests. And so the first idea is that the priests from the Melchizedek line, which we'll talk about what that is, they are greater than Aaron's line, and Jesus is from that line. And so Jesus, being from Melchizedek, and so it comes with some serious benefits for us. So this is good news. Like it's good news that Melchizedek is better than Aaron. It's good news that Jesus is from the line of Melchizedek, and that results for us in a lot of really powerful benefits. So that's the gist, and then you're going to get way more than you bargained for in this gist. So to start out, like our pastor who's written Hebrews does, he starts to pull something from the Old Testament and says, hey, here, you remember this thing? Like, you remember the angels? Jesus is greater. You remember Moses and the promised land? Jesus is greater. You remember, and our subject now is, hey, do you remember the line of the priests? Which, of course, they do. I mean, like, they're still having them up until that day. So while Moses is way old and Kadesh Barnea was, like, way in the past, to this day, as the writer of assuming Revelation was written before 70 AD, up until this man or woman writes this letter, there still would have been priests doing the things that we're talking about today. So it begins to compare and contrast Aaron and his sons and Christ. And so Aaron, hey, these are men taken from among men. So God looks at the 12 tribes, and it starts actually way before the tribes. It says, hey, Moses, your brother Aaron is going to be a priest. Which is bananas, because if you remember Aaron, like Moses goes up the mountain and Aaron's like, hey, everybody just bring me your gold. We'll make a calf. And then when Moses confronts him, he's like, oh, like I just put it in the fire and like this golden calf popped out. And that's the guy that we start with. So obviously we're not even starting with like the best and the brightest. But anyways, taken from among men. So later the lineage of Aaron becomes the tribe of Levi is what we believe. So coming out of that tribe. But Jesus is like Melchizedek. He's not plucked from among men. He has no beginning and no end. He is appointed by God, from God, and he is God. So it's not a man among men. This is a unique God-man among no others. There is no equivalent to Jesus. Even though Melchizedek is a type of him, there's no equivalent. Aaron's line, they offer gifts and sacrifices, is what the priests of old do. Jesus offers prayers and appeals in addition to these gifts and sacrifices. Like he's able to do this nonstop, is what this beginning passage says. And it says that they are clothed with weakness, which is a really interesting thing, because if you think about the clothing of the high priest, it was like ornate. I mean, it was expensive, like quite literally. Like, so like, you know, you have a plate of pure gold, you've got these 12 stones on the breastplate of righteousness, and each of the 12 stones represents a tribe. And that was to say, like, the high priest who would put this outfit on and once a year would enter into the Holy of Holies on the Day of Atonement, on Yom Kippur, would go into that holiest of place after he'd been purified. He had to be cleansed, and then he would go into that place. And part of this is a reminder that he carries the nation with him. So he's a representative of the nation to God. But it's incredibly, so like if you were to talk about like, hey, the priest is clothed with something, chances are the Jewish Christians that the author's writing to, this is what they're going to think of. And so the pastor knows what he's doing when he's like, no, they're clothed with weakness, not those priestly garments. I mean, they are, it's both. And then Jesus, of course, is not clothed with weakness, and he becomes a source of eternal salvation. So this is how chapter 5 begins, is comparing this Aaron line and this Melchizedek line and how Jesus' line is greater. So this brought me to, let's talk about the priests, because I did a deep dive on this in 2021 for grad school, and I just think this is fascinating. So you have to be held hostage and listen to this, or you can fast forward. It's fine. But I really want to talk about like what the priests did and who they were, because I think it's really fascinating. So like I said, they come from the line of Aaron, Moses' brother, and then it becomes the tribe of Levi. Now there are two classes of clergy within this. So there's the Levites. All Levites are like clergymen, like they're the tribe that have been chosen to minister between the people and God. But only the line of Aaron that they trace are the priests. And so there are all priests are Levites, but not all Levites are priests, if that makes sense. And so there's two different classes, priests, then Levites. Priests were of an elevated type, just because they had different and special privileges. They're supported financially by the Jews. So if you remember, when they come into the land, when the 12 tribes of Israel come into the land, God is giving the tribes their allotment, their portion, right? He's giving them the land flowing with milk and honey that he had promised Abraham, and then reiterated to the sons, and then tells Moses, like, let's go. Moses doesn't get to go. Joshua takes them in, all that good stuff. You remember the wanderings last week, right? So they'll get their land. And the tribe of Levi, though, is told, hey, I am your portion. This is God speaking to them. And you're your inheritance among the people. So in other words, y'all aren't getting a land. I should be enough for you. But also, the Jewish brethren are supposed to support them. So they give a tithe to the temple, essentially, to the priests and the Levites, so that the priests and Levites don't have to have a land. They can be supported by the work that they do. And they're meant to do work. Like it's like what pastors do today. Like, you guys tithe, and a lot of that does go to run the church. I mean, there's just like finances that come with it, but it also pays Martin and I salary so that we are available to do the work that you all need spiritually and otherwise. And so that's a little bit of, that's the idea. That's where we got this from. That's where Christians got the idea from, is from this temple Judaic way of doing things. There was a point when the people weren't being obedient. Shocker. But they stopped tithing, and so Nehemiah realizes the Levites have fled to their fields, which even that, like, the Levites aren't supposed to have fields, but if you remember, they get carried off, and then under the Medes and Persians, they're allowed to come back into the land and rebuild. The North never did. And so this is it's an interesting time in the history of the Levites. But Nehemiah comes and he's like, enough. Like, you need to start tithing again. Like, you guys need to be concerned about the work of God, and the work of God cannot go forward if you're not tithing. And so, because that money is not only used, it's same for your guys' tithe. It's not just used to pay for the lights. It's also used to bring about good in the community. And so, so they're supported by their brethren. During the first century, which would have been when this letter of this letter of Hebrews was written, about 20,000 priests and Levites, and they're spread out. I mean, they're all over the place, but 20,000, which is a lot. And then what they would do is they would divide the year into courses. Courses were 1 week. There was 24 of them, and then they would do like another 24. And so you would serve 1 week at the temple. So you might go, okay, hey, July 5th through the 12th is my week. And so you would go up to the temple to do your service that week. And then at Passover, everyone's on duty. So all 20,000 of those priests and Levites would be expected to be at Passover. All the Jews will be at Passover anyways, but they will be there because it's a big, huge celebration that was, sort of an all hands on deck type thing. So you would go out for your 1 week. And what was cool is you served with the same fellas. And so you kind of just knew, like, I don't know, I think it would have been like not like a vacation, like you were working, but I imagine it would be like a really sweet time at its best. I would imagine it's a really sweet time of camaraderie and brotherly affection. And I keep saying brotherly because no ladies were doing that. So, but yeah, so you'd come up to Jerusalem, and then during that time, you'd make sacrifices, make purifications, you'd rest. Like they had shifts, so not all the guys were on 24/7. And then, like I said, at Passover, everyone's on duty. And so on a low day, like just a Tuesday in July, which Nisan 57, that's not a date, 14, I'm trying to not pick a date that's Passover, but anyways, on a normal day, just whatever day, there would be about 20 to 25 priests available to offer sacrifices. Commonly birds were the most often sacrificed thing, so it's not always, like we always think of lambs and goats and whatever, but there were other things that were sacrificed for different reasons. And so a priest's work was like liturgical and butchery, and honestly, mostly butchery. If you read the accounts from first century authors where they talk about the work that they do, which is part of why priests retired at the age of 50. Like they weren't it was a physically taxing thing to do this work. I mean, there's not a whole lot of heavy lifting I do as a pastor. Like maybe y'all call me and say, hey, can you help me move? Like that's a rare exception, right? So, but for these guys, like their work was physical in addition to spiritual and emotional. So when they weren't serving those, so you kind of think like, wow, okay, so they're given the tithe, they live off of that, but they work 2 weeks out of the year, 3 weeks tops. Like what are they doing the rest of the time? It's a great question. Because I used to think that they all just lived in Jerusalem. I didn't think about the fact that they would be spread all over. And so when they weren't serving, they would tend to their own affairs. So they had jobs like scribal work, and they for better, like there is some pastoral parallels here. So they would spend their time studying, teaching, enforcing the law, and I mean by that like Jewish law. And so there's a dispute that pops up among two parties. Like they would, study the law, do their best to discern the right thing, and then enforce that. And that would be the thing. And so not like laws and like they caught you speeding, although that is, I mean, when you break the Judaic law, the Torah, that is some of it. So it is punitive at times. But yeah, I mean, part of their role was just to help the people be faithful. I mean, that was at their best, at their most intended purpose, was to be servants of God and servants of the people that helped the people to be faithful and mediated through sacrifices and liturgy and all of that. So it's a really, I asked the class on Tuesday, I was like, so like God's, handing out allotments to the tribes. There's maybe land that you think's better. I don't know how Ephraim feels. I don't know if the tribe that's split in two is like, wait, we like having the river run through us. I don't know if Judah is like, yeah, we like the south. We like keeping it down here. But I asked the question, how does that make, if you're a Levite, you are born knowing your job, period. And if you're of the line of Aaron, you definitely are born knowing your job. Is that a good thing? Does that excite you? Or would you rather just be of the tribe of Reuben, doing your own thing? I don't know. I think it depends on the kind of person you are. But it's an interesting thing to think about God plucked the tribe of Levi and said, here's the work that you're going to do. Because not all pastors' kids would make for great pastors. But it's sort of this idea of that's what faithfulness is all the Levites would participate in this liturgy. And so anyways, life was different back then. Okay. Like I said, priests did liturgical work, so they would hear confessions. So you come up, you put your hands on the animal, you say, hey, here's what we're confessing. We have fallen short, whatever the confession needs to be. They would accept the animal and inspect. So if you remember, you can't have blemishes on your on the animals that you sacrifice. Slaughter them. So, if it's cut their throat, let the blood drain out, hang them on a wall, there was a lot to it. Cut them up for distribution, depending on the type of sacrifice. Some things get burned up entirely to God. Some things get cut into portions, and the priest gets a portion, and God gets a portion, and actually the person who brought the sacrifice receives a portion. And so they do this, and then they also, recite scripture, they pray, they burn incense, they're doing this liturgical work. And the way that their work was done when they were making sacrifices, obviously not when they're reading scripture out loud, or obviously not when they're singing or anything like that, but when they were doing the sacrifices, the work was done skillfully and silently, which is interesting because most of my work is not done silently when like people come and they want to discuss things, but it's almost as if they recognize, hey, I'm just a mediator between you and God. So you're bringing your sacrifice, you're like doing your part, and I'm going to do my part, and then God's going to do his part. So I don't need to say anything. And so it's a super reverential way of sacrificing animals, I think. Priests were fit. Like, I don't think like super jack, like, having creatine for breakfast, but they would, you bring up you think about a couple 100-pound animal, right? You bring it up, you put your hands on it, they slit their throat, and then they're going to pick it up and put it on a wall, and then they're going to butcher the pieces. Like, this is significant work. So when they worked, they wore linen. They had specific clothes that they would wear. The scriptures talk about what it needs to look like, and they'd be cinched up around their arms, so they had to be like tied up so their arms could and kind of like worn up. Like they would have looked like prepared. Like they're not like dragging bloody clothes. I know it's disgusting, but that's how they would have looked. And then, so that's what the priests are doing. And then the Levites basically assist in all this work. So priests are going to do the sacrifices. Priests are going to do the things that only priests can do. They've been consecrated and prepared for that. Levites do things like become gatekeepers. They're the worshipers. In fact, there's a story where they appeal to the high priest or to the king, and they're basically like, the book, like the scroll with the psalms that we sing, it is so stinking heavy. Can we just memorize them and then we don't have to hold the book? And they were allowed to. And so they were armed guards because the temple had a lot of wealth. So one of the things that you brought to the temple, not only did you bring your sacrifices, but you brought your temple tax. And that wealth was used to be distributed among the people to care for them, but it held a lot of wealth. They also directed animal traffic, especially on the high holy days, right? Like there's thousands of people wanting to have their Passover lamb sacrificed. It's traffic. Like you're moving people through. And so it kind of gives you an idea, like the sight, the sounds, the smells, right? Like you're burning meat, which I imagine actually smells good. So it'd smell like a barbecue at the temple. But you'd also have blood, probably some feces, right? I mean, like they would keep it clean, but like it's quite an affair, like to think about how big these Passovers would be. And then some priests, of course, took care of the temple tax. And so there was different specific jobs that some priests might have in addition to the just yearly come up and serve your priestly thing. So the sacrifices every day. So when you think about the sacrifices, when it's your week and you're coming up, every single day without fail, the community would provide 2 yearling lambs that were offered to God and entirely burnt. So no one ate that meat. And in addition to lambs, there would be like cakes and a couple of other things. It was as if you're giving God his morning meal and his evening meal. And it sounds weird to us as moderns, but it's a way, it's like, I don't know, I think it's really beautiful. It's a like faithful way to say, like, we're in relationship with God and we want to give him the best of what we have. And so this would have been done every day. And on the Sabbath, it was double. And it was paid for by the temple tax. So again, you're like, where are they getting all this stuff? The temple tax. And then individuals, of course, brought sacrifices for all sorts of reasons. And exceptions were made for financial hardship. Like, there is a lot of anti-Semitism in our scholarship today. And it comes out by making it seem as if, like, the Jewish, religion was, like, insurmountably difficult to fulfill, as if like the Jews were like, I'm sorry that you're poor, but you can't then make a sacrifice, so you're never going to be right with God. Like it's just not how it worked. And so like if you came and you said, look, it's been a bad crop year, like we just don't have the means to sacrifice X and Y, but we want to. So if maybe the sacrifice should be a lamb, they would go, okay, can you afford 2 birds? And you go, oh yeah, we can afford to. And they go, okay, great, sacrifice. Like it was not, the Jewish people wanted to honor faithfulness. And this idea that it was extremely legalistic and extremely taxing and extremely harsh, like that's just not reality, especially in the first century. And so I think it's important that we're fair to that. Like we have this like cosmic battle in our minds, like Jews bad, Christians good. And I just like, we came up out of that and brought a lot of good with us from it. So anyways, so I want to give you like a Passover example. Okay. So this is You and your family, and maybe you guys are a smaller, less wealthy family, so then you're going to link up with 3 other families. So, Bill's family, Todd's family, Jamal's family. You guys are going to go from the tribe of Reuben, wherever you're located, and you're going to walk up to Jerusalem, because it's always up, and along the way, you guys love each other. It's fun. Like, your kids are all playing together, and you're singing the songs of ascent. You're camping together. You have prepared all year for this, so you've got money saved up. It's called the second tithe. You've saved up 10% to spend at this massive festival. Because you're coming a long distance, you didn't bring a lamb with you. You're going to buy one when you get there. And so you get there, and so Jamal is going to be your representative. And so Jamal is going to go up to the money changers, and y'all are going to pay a tax if you didn't have the right currency. So you're going to get the right tax. You're going to pay your temple tax. Great. And then Jamal is going to be like, hey, I need a yearling lamb for Passover. And they'll be like, okay, here. And so then Jamal is going to go over, and he's going to be directed by a Levite. Hey, Ishmael the priest is available. Follow me. Jamal's going to come up, and he's going to put his hands. Now, only men can be in this part of the court. Women and children would be somewhere else. But we think they could see it. Like, we're pretty sure the way that it was designed, like, they were kind of elevated, which is cool. And so, like, Jamal's wife and Bill and Ted, or whoever I said, their wives, like, people are watching it. He's going to put his hands on the head, and he's going to confess his sins. And then Ishmael, the priest, is going to slit its throat, let it bleed out. He's going to pick it up, and he's going to hang it on a wall, and he's going to chop it up. He's going to do a wave offering with a piece of it. He's going to, do his work skillfully. The fat and the entrails and all that goes to God. That gets tossed into the fire. That's God's. He's going to take his portion, which at Passover would be bananas, the amount of meat they get. But then he would hand back to Jamal the rest of the meat, which is the part I never really understood. And so, like, now Jamal's got a freshly grass-fed, grass-finished lamb, chopped and butchered. So he and the 2 other fellows and their wives and their kids, they're going to go out to wherever they're camping, and then they're going to have a Passover meal. And they're gonna do the Passover meal. And they're gonna drink their wine, and they're gonna eat their unleavened bread, and they're gonna, eat the horseradish, which is like the bitterness. Like, they're gonna have the lamb without the hip broken, right? It's amazing. Like, it's an amazingly beautiful process, and the priests are the ones that make it possible through their service and their butchery and all of that. So this is a lot of the work that the priests are doing. So it's generally considered a good thing. Like, were there evil priests? Yes. Like, were there intra-Jewish fighting where the Pharisees felt like sometimes the priests were too harsh? Yes. Were the Pharisees like a grassroots movement to allow all the people to be able to read Torah for themselves and be able to fulfill it? Yes. Like, was Nadab and Abihu bad guys who made strange fire? Yes. But generally, it's considered a good thing, and generally, it is a joyful thing to go up to Passover. Because we think, oh man, Passover, like, you got to go and be reminded, like, you're a big fat sinner. And you're like, no. You're going to celebrate God having passed over your house, and he rescued your people, and your family is atoned for through this meal, and you're going to rehearse this meal, and you're going to do it in the company of those you love. And you're not going to work. Like, nobody's working right now. We've left our fields, and we're in the city celebrating. Like, it's awesome. Like, it's awesome. Which brings me to then this discussion. So I gave, like, the hardest discussion questions maybe I've ever given in TAP, because I want y'all to feel some of the complexity of why you can understand why these Christian Jews would maybe return. Now, they shouldn't. They're wrong. Christ is better. But I want you to feel some of the weight of this. And so, if you're a first century Jew, and you've been coming up to Passover, maybe you're 30 years old, you've been doing it for 30 years. You see your friends that you love, there's a certain place in Jerusalem you love to go to. There's a part of the Seder meal that you just, like, love. It's your favorite part. It's your favorite cup. You're like, oh, yes, I love this part. And you know the promises of God from the Old Testament because you've been rehearsing them. And now Jesus has come, but he doesn't look anything like what you'd expect him to look. He doesn't look like David. And he dies and he rises again. And now they say, it's finished. You don't have to do that anymore. I think we think, oh, good, so much relief. I don't have to do that anymore, which is part of it. I think there should be relief. But if this is a generally good thing, how does it make you feel? And I think you guys may have conflicted feelings if you really think about it, which is what I'm trying to drive to. But I want you to take a moment and try to imagine yourself in the shoes and the sandals of a first century Jew who is converted to Christianity and the paradigm shift that is taking place for you and your community. Let me just take a moment and think about that. Okay, the author has talked about the old Aaron line. That's the excursus we just went on. Way more information you ever cared to know, but you know what? It's too bad. And then he says, hey, Jesus is from the line of Melchizedek. Melchizedek is one of the weirder parts of Scripture, and it only really makes sense like once Jesus comes, I think. Okay, so in Genesis 14, Abraham has just won a battle. He really has no business winning, and he's walking back to where he's been setting up camp, and there's a king from Salem who's called the priest of the Most High, and Abraham blesses him and gives him a tithe. Okay, this is bananas, right? And it says that like Melchizedek is this like, he's just this figure. Like, and Genesis is already weird, I'll just be honest with you, but you're like reading along, you're like, what was that about? And then you get to Psalm 110 that David writes, and he's like, hey, you are a priest in the order of Melchizedek. And you're like, that's that guy again. Who is this guy? Well, when Jesus comes along, suddenly, honestly, a lot of this makes sense. So he's a king from Salem, Shalem, Jerusalem. He's a king from Jerusalem that Abraham gives a tithe to, right? So he's like the priest. That's the forerunner to all the other priests who will receive a tithe from the sons of Abraham. Okay, this is crazy, right? Like Melchizedek is the first time we see an Abraham giving a tithe to a priest, and then later the sons of Abraham, Father Abraham, many sons of Abraham, they're going to give a tithe to priests. So Jesus is the ultimate fulfillment of the priest who was Melchizedek, who will take his priestly duties to Jerusalem. Okay, so it's kind of amazing. If you fast forward to Genesis 24, Abraham walks Isaac up to a mountain in the same place. Okay, so anytime you're studying your scriptures and place is mentioned, now sometimes the places change names, so you got to look it up and be like, Salem doesn't sound like Jerusalem, right? But it is. So when Abraham takes Isaac up the mountain to sacrifice him, and at the last second, there's a ram in the thicket, and a sacrifice takes place on the hill. Jesus is the ram. The ram is a type of Jesus. It's in the same place. So it's as if to say, in Jerusalem, there will be a priest and a sacrificial lamb, and guess who's both of those things? The Bible is just bananas. Okay, so Jesus comes from this line. He has no beginning and no end. And Melchizedek, so in the Bible, the kings come from the line of Judah. The priests come from the line of the Levites. Melchizedek is both a king and a priest. And Jesus is prophet, priest, and king as well. So he's from the line of Judah, but because he's from the order of Melchizedek, he's also a priest. See? Simple. Problem solved. Okay. So, like I said, the whole point of the 5 through 7 is Jesus is the priest, okay? Like, this is what the author is trying to drive to. So he starts 5, 1 through 10 by saying, hey, the old line of Aaron is not as great as the line of Melchizedek from which Jesus comes. Jesus is greater. And then like our author of Hebrews does, he will teach something, and then he'll be like, now here's your warning, okay? So he gives a pretty extended warning passage for us here in 5 through 6. And so he then said, like, it's kind of some of the strongest language in this letter, if not the strongest language in this letter. And so he tells them, he says, hey, you know what your problem is? Your problem is ultimately not your persecution. The problem is you have spiritual lethargy. You know why you want to go back? It's not because life is hard for you, which life was hard for them. That is part of why they want to go back. But he's like, it's ultimately, you don't have a persecution problem. Ultimately, you have a spiritual apathy problem. And this is what he tells them. He goes, look, I want to feed you solid food, but you're sucking on milk like little babies. Like, you don't even I'm trying to tell you about Melchizedek and these things of the Lord, like this strong theological thing, but you're down here. And because you only understand this much, it's causing you to fall back. Okay, and so this is what he warns them of. He's like, this is dangerous living. You don't want to live like this. And then he highlights the consequences of those who fall away. He says, look, for those who have tasted of the goodness of God, who've been in the community, kind of all these things, and they leave, they cannot return. And he goes, because you cannot crucify Christ again, twice. You can't put him back up on the cross. He was already up on the cross. You know what he did for you. So for you to turn your back to him and walk away, what are you going to put him back up on the cross again? And we'll talk a little bit about this language, because what people do is they take this portion of Hebrews and they make an entire argument about how you can lose your salvation. Now, I'm not, whether you can or can't lose your salvation, I don't believe you can. But this is not a passage I would start at. And I'll explain why, because I think the author of Hebrews is doing something very specific. But go back to thinking about this pastor. He knows this group of people well. He speaks to them intimately. Like, he's talking to them as someone who knows them. And so what's interesting is he has some of the harshest language for them, but then he's like, but hey, I have all the confidence in the world that you guys are going to persevere in faith, hope, and love. So which brings me to, I want you to remember, like when you're reading those warning passages, I want you to remember he's their pastor and he loves them. And there are things, when you have a loving relationship, you can get away with saying. Like right now, my current favorite insult is the word dweeb. I just like pick up old insults or old words. I like bringing them in. But it's like, it doesn't really cut that deep because it's the word dweeb. But also, I don't say it to people I've never met, right? I say it to people who have a strong love bond between us. So they're like, you dweeb, right? And so this is a pastor who is using all the tools of rhetoric available to him or her to provoke a people back into more faithfulness, okay? So when you think of it in that context, the language begins to make sense. If you were to pull Hebrews 6 out of context and believe that's the way you should speak to people you barely know or to people you have no real loving relationship with, it will not go well for you, okay? There's a privilege in this communication. I use the example of Matt Chandler used to call us all idiots in the early years of his preaching. He doesn't do that as much. I'm not necessarily endorsing that pastoral practice, but he would also end all of his sermons with, I love you more than you know, okay? So when someone's saying that to you every week, then when they call you an idiot, it lands a little differently than when the youth ministers would get their at-bat to finally get their sermon in, and they would call us idiots, and we would all be like, whoa. You don't love us the way Matt loves us. You don't pray for, you don't disciple, you're not our shepherd. You don't get to call us idiots. Now, probably shouldn't call anyone idiots, but I as someone who loves the insult idiot, I understand where Matt was coming from ish. But my point being, these warning passages are embedded in a deep, intimate, loving relationship, which allows him to kind of shake them. And so O'Brien in his commentary says they stand in need of renewed commitment and obedience to Christ based upon a deeper insight in what they profess. And so he's trying to call them to the deeper things, but he's like, you can't even do it because you're drinking this baby milk, okay? And so here's my interpretation. He says, look, I have much to say to you, okay? I want to talk about the deep things of God, but it's complicated, and y'all are not on the right state of mind to hear such lofty things. You guys are not thinking well about the Lord, you dweebs. That's what I think he's saying here, and I think he does it from a place of deep love. And so I just said this to the group on Tuesday. Shaming works in an honor-shame culture because there's a mechanism by which it works. Shaming does not work in an honor-fame culture, which is what we're in. You should not shame people. We've learned enough in our sociology to understand that shame is a very disruptive and painful mechanism that brings immediate results, but long-term turmoil and sometimes trauma. But if you're in an honor-shame culture where that is part of your currency, shaming is a part of your rhetoric. And I'm not endorsing it, I'm just saying it's effective. So just keep that in mind when you're studying Hebrews 6. This is not the kind of language I would necessarily use at St. Jude. Because we're in a completely different cultural context. I might call you dweebs, I might, but when I'm calling you guys to deeper affections of the Lord, well, I take that back. You know what? I think in some ways, when you've earned the right to kind of go, hey, I'm trying to get y'all to a place of greater obedience, but I think y'all are distracted by things of the world. That would be something a pastor could say, right? Which is ultimately what this pastor is saying. He's like, look, your problem, you don't have a COVID problem. You have a spiritual apathy problem. That's why you haven't done X, Y, and Z or whatever. You've probably heard pastors or religious leaders say that. And I think that can be done in the context of deep, abiding, faithful, committed relationship. Okay, y'all are understanding what I'm saying. If you're not, text me, we'll talk about it. Okay, so back to this idea though. Can you lose your salvation is a question people want to ask of Hebrews 6. It's not a bad question, but I want to say, like, that's not the question, though, that the author of Hebrews is trying to answer. So my point being, it's not that it's not a fair question to lay upon it, but he's doing something else in this passage, right? It's almost as if he's mocking them. He's like, you guys have seen, right, that he died on a cross and rose again, and you're talking about going the other way? What are you going to do, put him back on the cross? Like, it's that kind of rhetoric. It's not in like this forensic view of justification type conversation. And so what I would say to this is, if you're not sure what you believe about the assurance of salvation, all of Bible study is helped by looking at clearer passages on a topic and moving toward the more obscure. So I said this once, like, if you want to develop a theology of circumcision, you don't start with Moses' wife cutting off the foreskin of her son and throwing it at Moses' feet and being like, yes, I understand circumcision. Like, no. So there are other passages where the author is speaking to this issue. This author is speaking to a group of people who are in danger of walking away, and he's trying to provoke them with the tools of rhetoric that he has. So whether or not he speaks to this question or not, I think is a little bit different. Okay. So ultimately what he's saying, though, is like, hey, like, keep going. So he, like, calls them a bunch of babies sucking on milk who can't eat solid food, and then he's also like, you are dearly loved friends. Keep going, okay? This is why you have to read letters often in their fullest context, because you get a sense of what he's doing here. And if you read Hebrews in its fullest sense, you don't come away being like, this guy's a jerk. You come away saying, man, he really loves these people, and he's trying to use every rhetorician tool he has to express a love and a concern and a desire for them to persevere in the faith. Okay, so discussion. Like I said, these weren't easy questions on Tuesday, but I like them. So you're the pastor. You are trying to get a group of people to move toward Christian maturity. How do you do it? What do you say to them? Okay, put yourself in the pastor's shoes. Now, the Tuesday night crowd, they were not fooled. They were ready for me. So they said things like, well, who are the people? Which is a great question to answer. Like, are they young? Are they old? What kind of culture do they live in? Like, what kind of relationship do I have with them? Okay, but it's a good question to consider. So take a moment, think about it. Like, are there people in your life that you want to call to greater Christian maturity? How would you do it? It's a good question to think about. Okay, so the last section of Hebrews 6 through 7 ends by talking about Melchizedek. So he's said to them, like, hey, I want to teach you the deep things of God, but I can't because you guys are in a spiritual apathetic realm. But I believe that you're going to press on. So here's some information about Melchizedek. And so 6:13 through 20, he says to them, listen, you can trust the things that I'm telling you, because look at how it worked out for Abraham. Okay, Abraham trusted God, and look at the covenant that was created through that. So you can trust God with what I'm saying, because as faithful as God was to Abraham, that's how he'll be faithful to you. Then 7:1 through 10, he's like, let me remind you about Melchizedek, and he kind of explains Genesis 14, although it's still bizarro. And then 7:11 through 28 is like, now let's get to the meat. This is what I'm talking about. You guys want to go back to the temple? You want to go back to your sacrifices? No. Let me tell you about the supremacy of Christ's priesthood. So this is the supremacy. He lives forever. The text literally, he says, look, the other priests, they're dead. They die. They're gone. Which means none of them are living to intercede for you. So you come up, you put your hand on his head, he's like, okay, slit the throat, does this thing, here's your meat. Guess what? That transaction is over. What do you need the next time you need a sacrifice? You got to go do it again, and do it again, and do it again, and do it again. Not with Christ. Christ saves you completely because he lives to intercede for you. He is making you pure and praying on your behalf, and made the sacrifice on your behalf, and because he lives and reigns forever, you don't have to keep going back. Your priest is living to intercede for you for eternity. The text says he's holy, innocent, undefiled, separated from sinners, and exalted above the heavens. Like, it's a whole bunch of adjectives in a row. The author of Hebrews knows what he's doing. He could have just said he's holy. So therefore, he's the best. But he's going on. He's like, you guys, the old priests, before they could make sacrifices for you, had to make one for themselves because they were clothed in weakness. Not Christ. He is never going to be in a state where he can't sacrifice for you. So you know your problem is, right, in the story, the Good Samaritan story, it's fantastic. I mean, like, it is just so provocative. It's so good. But it says a priest and a Levite were going up to the temple, probably to serve in there 1 week. So were they wrong for not helping the man beaten? Yes. Yes, of course they were. God would say, hey guys, that's the work. Like, we do all of this to bring about human flourishing. So don't ignore the person in need to go do this. They're wrong. But you can begin to understand though, they can't make sacrifices for you if they touch the dead body. Now, there were 19 other priests and Levites. So there's no excuse. I'm not making excuses for the priests and the Levite. I kind of am. I want to soften why, because then all of a sudden the Samaritan walks by and he's like, let me help you. And never who's more faithful? And they're like, the one who helped. They won't even say the word Samaritan, right? Jesus is not going to stumble upon a dead person. He's not going to accidentally sleep with his wife on the wrong day. This is kind of a thing, certain sexual things prevent them from being able to make sacrifice. Now, all the priests and Levites, there's a way to be cleansed so that they can be restored to service. But the point being, Jesus will never not be fit to intercede for you. He was the sacrifice once and for all. You don't have to keep going back. It's done. It's finished. And he's the Son who is perfect. It's a perfect sacrifice for you. Perfect. So, if Jesus wasn't our high priest, what would life look like today? It's another tough question. I know, I told you. Yeah, hit pause, think about that. Okay, so what? What's our big so what? Jesus is constantly interceding for you. This is great. He is every day, at all times, every minute of every day, making you pure. Because he's the eternal priest. He's every day making sure you are in a place of cleanness, which means